Does Trump even have a plan? This is a question that's been being circulated not only among critics of Trump's, but even of proponents of him. As the Trump administration goes on, it's becoming increasingly more clear that there doesn't seem to be a unifying plan that holds together his economic policy. And one of the biggest criticisms that myself and many others have posed is his tariff policy and whether or not it's actually a good vision for the nation. In this video, I'm going to be discussing the history of tariffs, what tariffs are, and a possible reason why he's so focused on tariffs. In addition, you'll want to stay to the end because I'll be discussing whether or not Doge itself is a good idea and setting up the ideas and terms necessary to understand the answer to the question, does Trump actually have a plan? So the first part I guess we want to get into is the introduction, right? We want to understand the current modern events and what's been going on and why this is important even. So Trump won the 2024 election on one of the biggest, most historic victories because he's the second person to ever be reelected in non-consecutive terms, and also because he lost previously in such a famous manner, right? January 6th did not go unnoticed by both sides. However, he promised the American people to fix the economy. Over and over again, all of these polls, right, Gallup, Harvard, Harris, showed consistently the number one problem people had with the Biden administration was the economy. It was the number one problem that Americans wanted to see fixed. And Trump came in with the blazing promise to keep winning, right? If I had more time to work on this video, maybe I'd try to figure out on my software to play the video, but he wanted to win, he wanted to win big. However, we're not seeing that right now. As of late, as of last Wednesday, which I believe was the 6th, right? 7th, the stock market jumped heavily. When Trump announced his sweeping tariffs for many different nations across the world of a minimum of 10%, we found that the stock markets did not take this lightly. We'll get into this a bit later about why this matters and why this actually happened, but we saw a historic decrease in the Dow Jones Stock Exchange, or even the Nasdaq, or Standard & Poor, S&P, right? All of these different indexes for different stocks in America dropped heavily. The day after, Trump announced that we would have a 90-day pause on most of these tariffs, after which there would be an increase in some. For example, China would go up to 125% instead of the 104% number that we saw before. And this caused extreme optimism, right? We saw historic jumps in the stock market, right? Like 24%, 25% to this company, that company, right? Even more for some. The most historic jump in stocks since World War II. So now that we have some of that introduction and modern stuff out of the way, let's go into what a tariff is and how this goes into Trump's plan. So a tariff is a fee imposed on imported goods to a nation. This means that this is done at the customs level, not at the individual level, although often the cost is passed on to the customer. This means that instead of something costing $20, a 50% tariff would mean that it costs $30. And the manufacturer can choose either to pay that out of their own hands or pass it along to the consumer, which is the often easier thing to do. And this is one of the most important parts that people constantly bring up, that tariffs cost consumer, and therefore, the price levels change, and this just screws up a lot of stuff and hits some industries, but not others, and that creates uncertainty in the economy, and that's one of the negative aspects. However, there's two different functions a tariff poses: protective and revenue. So protective tariff is when you want to protect domestic industry, right? When you want companies in America to have the best chance to succeed compared to other countries. For example, car manufacturing. Let's say you want American dollars to be spent on American goods so it stays inside of our country. That's pretty obvious, right? So you want, for example, Ford to do better than Nissan, or I believe Nissan's Japanese, right? So what you do is you make it harder to bring in Nissan cars. While you definitely still bring Nissan cars in, it's going to be more expensive not only to the customer, but to the manufacturer. There's going to be many more different loopholes and, just different holes they need to jump through, right, to actually get it to happen. And that makes it a more protective tariff because it means that you're not able to actually bring in foreign imports, and therefore you're forced to prioritize domestic products. The problem here is that when you announce sweeping tariffs, even domestic products, right? Even Ford cars need to use, for example, metal from Korea, or they need to have rubber from the Congo, or something like that. And if you have tariffs on those, the very raw material gets tariffed. However, the final product itself technically doesn't. And that's one of the big caveats that you see when proponents of tariffs are saying that American goods aren't going to be increasing in price. And that certainly might be true for a very few industries which are 100% American made, or 100% American made companies of certain industries. However, for a large majority of companies, they are a part of the global supply chain and therefore will be affected by sweeping tariffs. And that there's revenue tariffs. Revenue tariffs have been historically lower, and they've been just simply to produce revenue for the government. Right, the government charges money at a customs level to bring in certain products. And should a company choose to bring in that product, they have to pay this small fee to the government. And this helps build revenue, right? Government gets more money, and therefore they can spend it. And this was one of the main ways that America itself made money, right? Income tax wasn't a thing, I believe, until, I want to say like the 16th Amendment. I might be completely wrong. But until like the early 20th century, income tax was non-existent. So revenue and sales tax was revenue tariffs and sales tax were the main ways government made money. One of my problems is that what you get once you can't just leave behind, right? The tools for one crisis are often borrowed for the next, or even are the cost for the next ones. In the 1940s and the late 1930s, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt drastically increased federal spending. This was due to the Great Depression and due to the necessities posed by World War II. This massively increased not only the amount of departments we have, but federal spending. Our tax rate went up so much, and the government has just so much money to spend with that I guess we got addicted to it sort of as a solution to a lot of things, and we never got rid of that. And therefore, our federal deficit has been ballooning ever since, and we've been paying more taxes, and there's been just more reliance on the government to do things. And maybe that shouldn't have, even if that was the inevitable outcome, it shouldn't have been just a legacy of the World War II era, right? It should have been something that was built up naturally. Because while tariffs were, initially, of course, unpopular due to a few reasons, they were a major source of revenue for America, right? And there's two major tariffs that I want to point out. So first, one of the big things about tariffs is that they can definitely lessen trade. If it's more expensive to bring in foreign products, you're not going to bring in foreign products. You're going to prioritize domestic products. So that's good at protectionism level, but that means there's less global cooperation and more chance for global strife. Right? We've seen multiple times that economic cooperation between countries result in a less chance of war because they're just so reliant on each other and they can't risk having a serious war in which both of their trade interests could be hurt. So the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 was designed for protection but ended up starting a trade war with many countries across the world. This was during the times of the economic depression and only prolonged it instead of actually giving a solution. It did generate revenue, however, because of all these different factors like low consumer demand, high supply, the tariff didn't really end up doing that much. Next is the 1890 McKinley tariff. I guess it wouldn't be next, but in order of importance, which protected domestic industries, but made costs much higher for Americans. Again, an example of it serving a certain purpose, whether it be revenue or protectionism, but at the cost of the consumer or lessening trade. And that's what the history of tariffs have been, right? We've had equally as many tariff bills that seek to reduce tariffs, right? And what that does is it helps you foster better trade relations, so it's better to, easier to trade with America. But America isn't the only country that, issues tariffs on others. As of late, at least of the last 50, 60, 70 years since World War II, other countries have had tariffs on America as well, often at high rates that, benefit them to a certain degree, they feel, right? Now, we have a deficit. We spend a lot of money trying to import stuff to them or export stuff to them and, paying that fee out at the custom level to their company. And we felt that that's unfair. And that's what Trump is trying to address. Whether or not it's successful, we don't know yet. And let's get into that very thing itself. Excuse me. So this is a graph that the Trump administration released very recently about total tariffs charged to USA on the left, and the USA, what the USA is going to do to reciprocate that tariff. Often, reciprocal tariffs are about at half of what they pose to make some of that back. So, but you know, a lot of these, you know, you say 10%, 10%, but there's a minimum 10% sweeping tariff. So what I found interesting about this is that this isn't accurate, right? On the left, he bunches together their actual tariff rate, and in addition, the different trade barriers or costs that are posed, whether it be, you know, long travel distances, or maybe there's piracy in the region, or there's other issues that we need to deal with with some of these countries. He calculates that and adds that into the tariffs charged to the USA. However, regardless, what this does show is that there's a bunch of countries that have, you know, that do indeed have legitimate tariffs to the USA that we are also trying to reciprocate. Notably, you have like the United Kingdom, which you would think is a big trade partner as well, and of course they are, but they're not part of the EU anymore, and they only have a 10% tariff on the USA, and therefore we are reciprocating with only the bare minimum. There's a function out there that someone discovered about how we actually calculated the reciprocal rate, but I don't have that right now to share, so I do recommend you search it up if you're interested. And this gets into section 4, concepts of a plan. We all heard that, you know, famous blunder, honestly, of a PR job at the debate, where he said he has concepts of a plan on how to fix the economy. While it wasn't popular, it was definitely better, or people liked it more than Kamala Harris rambling on about her middle class upbringing. But this worries a lot of people now, because back then, sure, it's okay if he only has concepts of a plan, but where is that plan now? There isn't a long-term economic plan from the Trump administration for how they're going to go with tariffs or Doge. We'll get into why I think there is a plan in Section 5, push and pull, but first let's discuss the lack of a actual response from the Trump administration regarding these tariffs. So we haven't had the public has not received any general legitimate communication on what these tariffs will do, their long-term economic impact, the, you know, numbers by years, how they're going to impact Americans individually. Will this increase prices by how much? Right? We received vague assurances of a long-term plan, and we did receive a general idea that things are going to be bad in the short term. But that doesn't actually give any credibility to their plan, because there isn't a long-term vision involved. There isn't anything involved that says that we're going to be good in the long term. Because after all, one of the biggest, you know, benefits and faults of the American system is that a president can only be in office for 4 years, 8 years, right? 4 years at a time. And so if this is a long-term plan where we will need to take hits in the short term to, you know, have like a super America in the next 20 years, that's great. But first, we need to not only see the vision of that, we need to see the numbers of that. We also have to get the whole country on board, make it a popular idea. So if Democrats win in 2028, they're able to legitimize keeping that policy, which I don't think they will be able to do without having like a general press release or a report or economic study that actually shows the long-term effects of their plan or what the plan itself is. What my suspicion is that he's trying to sort of recreate the Roaring '20s, right? And this was a time post-World War I where America was not directly involved. We made a lot of money from selling arms, and Europe was really poor and really dependent on America, and therefore we had so much easier trade relations where we were not the ones in deficit, they were. And the Smoot-Hawley tariff we mentioned earlier kind of helped Europe, you know, go build itself up and not be dependent on the USA. Not that it was due to the Depression, of course. But if you want that economic success of the 1920s, you can't do that you can't do the policy then without taking into account the historical context of a weak Europe. Europe is currently, due to America, once again, Europe is remilitarizing. They're getting stronger. They're trying to focus more on domestic, you know, stuff going on within the European Union. Right? Germany's rearming again, which is kind of scary, but, you know, it seems like a good thing for now. You know, the whole marching through Poland to fight Russia thing, right? That's been a great idea. But you see that Europe is just trying to focus more and more on itself, while places like Britain are sliding down, right? They're just becoming like a backwater once again. But given this, I have one more thing that the Trump plan did pose as a potential plan or a solution even that I want to address. Two things actually. Number one is with tariffs. To make up for the higher prices, apparently the Trump administration posed a proposal for decreasing or actually eliminating income taxes for households under $150,000 per year. This sounds like a great idea, right? If everything's more expensive, great. If I have more money, so be it. Nothing really changes for me. In fact, it might even get better. The problem with this idea is that, $150,000 is a lot of money for many, many people, and there's a lot of people who don't make that, and therefore we make a lot of money and revenue from taxes. Of course, we still have $38 trillion or whatever in federal debt, but we still make a lot of money from our income taxes, and eliminating this by 2030, I believe, or 5 to 10 years, we're going to be losing like anywhere from 10 to 18 trillion dollars in revenue. I believe that was the Economist number. So it doesn't always seem like a good idea, and maybe that's okay. But we haven't seen how much money these tariffs are going to actually generate the U.S. And how that money is going to be used. Will it just be used to pay off the federal debt? Will it be used for reallocation of resources? Will it be redistributed to the American people? We don't know any of this because there's no actual plan for how this money is going to be used. Next is what I believe is the bigger problem. Doge. So Elon Musk promised to step down after cutting $1 trillion of the American federal spending. Whether that's possible or not, is beyond me, but the important thing is that the $1 trillion per year is a number decided. And honestly, that's great. There's no one that should be against genuine efficiency cutting, right? When you start trying to cut maybe places you shouldn't to make up that number is a problem. But the bigger thing that you get out of this is that in reality, our federal debt is so big that $1 trillion per year reduced isn't going to change that much. My generation, the next generation, the generation after that, someone's going to need to pay for all of this, whether it be through, exorbitantly high taxes or crazy labor rates, right? We already discussed this in a previous video about how trying to support a larger, above generation before us, or trying to pay off a large federal debt, and how stressful that can be for younger populations. And that's worrying because we're going to default eventually, and that's not going to be a very good thing for the world. Or we might not if modern monetary theory holds its face. But how much is the average American getting affected by this $1 trillion per year cut? Right? Because we've had no, actual semblance of a plan posed and given to us by the Trump administration about whether this money will be redistributed, whether it's not, or whether it's only going to pay off the federal deficit, whether it will be used to reallocate to better programs, more Social Security, for example, which doesn't seem to be the case at all. How is the average American benefiting from government cuts? Because while it might, reduce each person's single per capita debt that they need to pay back to, pay back this $38 trillion debt, while it may do that, how does that affect anyone in the real world, right? How does it help you in the real term or in the short term? And that's not going to happen. And it's more pressing because there's a very big chance, again, that this isn't a long-term plan. That, unless he becomes dictator or something, which is, probably out of the question given the American system and how good it is at preventing stuff like that from happening. But given that he's not going to be in power for, after 3.5 years now, there's no guarantee that any of this will actually have a lasting impact. Especially because Doge has constitutional concerns, whether we're allowed to actually have something like that, whether Elon Musk will be around, whether Vivek Ramaswamy will be around. We don't know any of this, and there's been no actual substantiation by the Trump administration whether or not any of this matters, how it's going to affect the consumer, right? Let's say we cut $1 trillion in, government spending each year. Great. What does that give me? What does that give me, like a fat paycheck? Probably not. Does it ensure that I won't have to pay back debt in 50 years? Maybe, but that won't probably happen either. So what's the plan? What is the point of Doge and the tariffs? And for Doge, I really have no answer, and there doesn't seem to be a good one out there, or any good explanation, period. But finally, let's get into the push and pull idea. I do think there is an idea with the tariffs. So at the beginning of the term, he proposed many different tariffs, and this caused waves, right? Like 10%, 12%, 25% on Mexico and Canada. But these have been pushed back basically indefinitely, once and then twice. Then it'll be pushed back again, I'm sure. And what this does is it's a constant threat that these countries, which are equally reliant on exporting, they're our biggest trade partners with America, won't like tariffs either. And if they have reciprocal tariffs, their prices go higher. And they don't have the economical strength that America does to actually live up to these, so they're going to eventually cave. And this also applies to China. China is not doing well right now. We saw in 2008 the consequences of a poor real estate market, or even real estate caused economic shocks. And China's real estate market has been terrible ever since, at the very least, the 2020s. This is because for a long time, the Chinese government sponsored and abetted the creation of new construction jobs, which caused construction for construction's sake without any real demand. And therefore, what you saw happening was that there was a really inflated supply, but not a lot of demand, or not a lot of people that can actually afford to buy up these homes that the government sponsored. And that proves that China is, like even currently, not even in the greatest economic state. Their average person, again, is not very rich. You have the megacities, sure, but China itself is technically still like a second world country if you really think about it, outside of the urban areas. If you see all these pictures, news reports, first-hand accounts, China is not a rich country, and therefore will be unable to actually reciprocate these tariffs for very long without it being a very big part of their without it becoming a big problem. Also, we're a bigger part of China's economy than they are to us. Therefore, having a poor trade relation with us will only hurt them more. This gives us leverage, and that's what I believe this whole Trump tariff thing is about. It's about leverage and making threats over and over again. And that's why I believe that the Mexico and Canada tariffs will never happen. We'll keep threatening them. We'll keep threatening, maybe trying the 10% out, right? Fix the border. Send your own troops to stop the fentanyl crossing, right? Then we can talk. But until then, we'll always have this overhead looming threat of we're going to, slam you with tariffs. And if you don't put reciprocal tariffs that hurt your own economy back, you're just going to lose out, right? And therefore, you're going to find that there's a push and pull effect, right? I'll push my tariffs, right? Then you'll say you want to do something. But then if you start to retaliate, I'll pull it back. And just repeat this until more of USA's foreign policy goals can be achieved, because America just spends a lot of money on stuff that isn't directly related to us. However, if via tariffs we can compel other countries to take care of it themselves, then we get a win because we're not spending as much money. But again, just because we're not spending money doesn't that mean that it benefits your average citizen or consumer, right? If we're spending $60 billion less in Ukraine, for example, right, how does this affect the average person? That's just congressional money that's going to be spent anyways, right? Money saved is not money earned when it comes to modern monetary theory, because a lot of this money doesn't really exist, and it's just like a form of credit. And what I think was the most recent event, right? I mentioned that this past week, at least as of April 11th today, that we saw a huge drop after Trump actually tried to implement these tariffs, and then a huge jump after he took them back for 90 days. I believe that, in the most generous reading of this possible, this would be that he wasn't getting what he wanted, so he implemented it for a day, maybe a day and a half, right? To show the world, this is what will happen to not only our economy, but yours, should you not listen to our foreign policy concerns. And it sort of worked. 51 more countries came to the negotiating table, trying to see if they can do more to get these tariffs lessened. And that's what I believe the push and pull is. He pushed really hard this time, and he pulled back immediately for another 90 days. And then, we'll see if that 90 days gets an extension, or whether it gets, whether it's indefinite, or whether we have to do this again. But Trump is effectively playing with our economy to actually achieve something. And that's why I feel that this plan, this quote-unquote plan, is dangerous, but also valid for tariffs, at least. He's a big foreign policy guy trying to use our own economy as leverage against the others, because he understands that our economy is more powerful and resistant to change than others. So that's what I think about Doge and tariffs. Doge has no plan whatsoever and doesn't seem to be actually impacting the everyday American, and we don't seem to be getting anything back on an individual basis or even household basis. On the other hand, tariffs don't affect anyone individually except for rising costs and reciprocal tariffs. However, there does seem to be some foreign policy goals that he does seem to be trying to deliver on. one of the other things that Trump's promised, obviously, is the immigration stuff, right? And the border and the security and, less American foreign involvement in wars. And maybe this will win us that. But only time will tell whether or not any of this will last, whether it'll work, whether we have a plan released by the White House. We'll see. So this was a bit of a different video. It's much more modern, but let me know what you guys think about this video. Any comments, criticisms, critiques, or concerns that are productive, I will address immediately. So please leave a comment and leave a like down below. So that's been the Rhetoric Viewed. Out.